Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day here with my colleague, Sumantra Maitra, and this is a special episode because we have a fantastic guest, Brandan Buck of the Cato Institute. Brandon is an expert on U.S. foreign policy, so that's what we'll be talking about today, and there certainly is a lot to talk about. On Russia Ukraine, the Trump and Putin summit in Budapest is off, or maybe postponed indefinitely, it's hard to say. Ukraine struck a chemical plant inside Russia with British provided missiles, and that probably means the US provided targeting intelligence, so I guess we're doing that again. On Latin America, Trump has massively increased America's military power in the Caribbean and is regularly launching strikes against alleged drug vessels. A recent strike took out a submarine, or I guess a semi submersible vessel, or something like that. It doesn't go completely underwater. There is a silver lining in all this on the issue of Israel and Gaza, with Trump brokering a ceasefire and comprehensive peace deal in the Strip, but that ceasefire seems very fragile. And Israel launched a wave of attacks against Gaza this weekend after claiming, falsely, we think, that Hamas had violated the truce. I definitely want to discuss these issues, but first, to kind of set the table for our discussion, Brandon, you and Beckett Elkins co authored a recent piece in The American Conservative entitled, When Peace Through Strength Means War is Peace. I liked it a lot. I had been wanting to write about the slogan, Peace Through Strength, and some of my problems with it, but I hadn't got around to it. I probably couldn't have done it justice. So I was really glad when that piece came in from you and your co author. Can you kind of walk us through the analysis in your piece? The three of us were all very historically minded, but if you could, you can mention the history of it, but if you could kind of keep it focused on, what it means for the Trump administration, how they use the slogan, what you see as the politics of all of this, and then what is the upshot of your article for thinking about Trump's foreign policy?
Yeah, so the piece is about peace through strength and the history of the term, and it argues that since the early Cold War, conservative Republican presidents have used the phrase to signal a departure from an earlier liberal and internationalist flavor of U.S. foreign policy, but in actuality, one of conserving all of the core assumptions and core tenets of said policy. And so, for the modern piece, talking about the Trump administration, the piece argues that with presidents' campaign rhetoric and I would say, some, personal impulses towards restraint, particularly through a America First lens, is in tension with this now peace through strength mantra, which has come to dominate his second administration, and that if the president doesn't reverse course and move towards more of a defined America First foreign policy, uh, centered on restraint and a narrow conception of the American interest, that he's going to allow hangers on, neocon, holdovers and the like to smuggle into his administration uh, larger goals for American foreign policy that are much more like the liberal international status quo, and thereby become the latest iteration of this phenomenon in which a president offers retrenchment through peace through strength, but in actuality wants conserving the foreign policy status quo.
Yeah, and as I said, I had been thinking a lot about this peace through strength slogan and was very glad to see your article because, you can tell that more hawkish Republicans and conservatives who want to maintain good relations with the Trump administration have really seized on this slogan because you can, if we take out Venezuelan drug vessels, we can say, or alleged drug boats, I should say, we can just say, well, that's peace through strength. The strength is attacking them, and then there's peace afterwards. And you see the same thing in justifying the strikes on Iran, for example. Any kind of military action is seen as the strength necessary to get to peace. You mentioned a kind of distinction between the first Trump administration and the second, and I want to hear you talk a little bit more about that and where you think all of this is going. Do you think that Trump is, because there was some uncertainty as we were heading into the second Trump administration. It seemed that he was going to have a lot more experience under his belt, that he had a lot of time to plan how to execute his agenda. And some people thought that that meant the second administration would be more restraint minded when it came to foreign policy and better able to kind of, thwart the deep state and pursue retrenchment, for example, in Europe and the Middle East. So, can you talk about what you've seen from the second Trump administration and how it compares to the first?
Well, in the second, he has multiple crises to deal with, right? In the first, he could run against legacies of the forever wars in the Middle East, and I mean, just about everyone in Washington now has had to come to a Jesus moment on those wars. But now, in the second administration, now we have multiple crises, and including one now brewing in the Caribbean, and of course Taiwan and China just so over the horizon. It's much more difficult to practice restraint and extricate oneself from said crises, particularly when I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think restrainers of various stripes often saw Trump's transactional nature as being a benefit, right? I mean, if you're a non-ideological actor, you're going to be less necessarily wedded to keeping some of these things going, but I think now that we're 9 months or so into the new administration, I think you're seeing that transactional nature being used against restraint, particularly in places like Venezuela, whereas before you had Stephen Miller um, and Rubio at odds with one another. Certain things have happened behind the scenes to bring those interests into alignment, and I mean, and of course, the president has long had designs on some sort of regime change going back to his first administration, but it seems to be happening now, or at least far more likely, because these interests have come back into alignment. And I also think a lot of the president's detractors have often said that he's not amenable to others, and he's boorish, but he's quite amenable to counter arguments and also influence. And I think we've seen that work against him in Europe, right? I mean, it just seems like every day we're going back to retrenchment, back to the status quo, in large part due to the fact that the president, in fairness, is still enmeshed in a series of interests, particularly in the conflict in Ukraine, Russia, the United States, obviously, and also the European Union. I think the same thing can be said for Israel as well. So it's difficult to extricate oneself from crises. And I think if there was like an avenue to really get some sort of substantive restraint, it would have been during the first administration, and less so the second.
Yeah, I want to talk about these various crises, in particular, the one pertaining to Russia, Ukraine. And there has been a lot of vacillating on the part of the Trump administration when it comes to that war. But Brandon, you were talking about the crisis in the Caribbean, which I would argue is one that the Trump administration kind of generated. They didn't inherit that particular one. And you also mentioned Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and Stephen Miller, who I think his official title is Deputy Chief of Staff, but he's like a top advisor on domestic and increasingly foreign policy issues. So, Matra, I'd be curious to hear from you, what your sense is of the kind of behind the scenes factional infighting. It definitely seems, and Politico recently reported that Rubio and Miller have kind of coalesced on Latin America stuff, as Brandon just alluded to. So, can you talk about where the administration's policy is heading on Venezuela? Who is the driving force behind all of this? Where does Rick Grinnell fit in? And I'm just curious in general, where the heck is JD Vance? Like, he is the main voice for restraint. Do you think that he is a major influence behind the scenes? He's in Israel right now. It's his turn to babysit, to make sure Netanyahu doesn't violate the Gaza ceasefire. Then it'll be Rubio who comes in later, I believe. But just talking about Latin America, how do you see the factional infighting and where are we heading, you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is a talk in the town, as most of the people of listeners of this podcast they have heard before, but also uh, you've read probably in Bloomberg or in Politico, like people are saying that this is fundamentally a Rubio Miller foreign policy. That has been like the first few months of this administration was very different. Commerce, not chaos. We are going to burden shift in Europe and all that, and then suddenly it feels like this is no different than the first Trump administration, or potentially even a DeSantis administration. Like, I mean, probably a DeSantis administration would have been more pro-Israel compared to a Trump one. But I wouldn't actually go and say that this Trump administration is anti-Israel or a restrainer. They are still, it might not be as bad as a DeSantis administration, but it is pretty near one when it comes to the Middle East. So a couple of things. The first point is about Venezuela and Latin America in general. There is an America first logic to focus more on the Western Hemisphere. That is understandable. Like if someone wants to make that argument that, look, we are retrenching from the Middle East, we will retrench from Europe, and we would only broadly focus on stopping China as a peer rival, fundamentally, we are going to focus on Latin America. Why? Because of three different reasons. One, we have mass migration. A lot of people are coming from Latin America because they don't have jobs and order in those places. And we are going to focus on those places where they have jobs and order there. So even if it's not like inshoring of manufacturing in this place, like where we are inviting the people to come and work, it would be nearshoring in our own hemisphere. We are going to secure our supply chains. We're going to secure our food supplies. So that is a valid argument. The second argument would be like on securing your minerals from a Chinese hegemon. There is a debate even going on in Europe whether they should buy more minerals from Latin American countries, for example, in Colombia and Venezuela, Guyana. So there is that argument which could be made about an America First foreign policy. What we are seeing, though, is that rhetoric which is being used for more of a neoconservative regime change operation. Like if you really want to secure supply chains from Venezuela, for example, guess who is the most interested in coming to a deal with the United States? It's Maduro. He doesn't want to be toppled. He is bending over backward to essentially offer every single thing of his country, and we are saying no. Why? Because the intention of this administration has never been about securing supply chains or get nearshoring manufacturing or providing order in Latin America. It is about regime change. The Trump administration, even in 2017, wanted regime change in Venezuela. They are essentially following the same playbook, just with a different individual. Second, when it comes to drugs, obviously Brandon has written a lot about it, so he'll be able to say more than me. But there is no evidence so far that fentanyl comes from Venezuela. There is no evidence. If we genuinely are planning to do a war on drugs, one, it would be a supply side war on drugs, which would mean like a drug war in the streets of the United States, where the people are the ones who are consuming the drugs. But second, even if we don't do that, the countries which would probably, or at least potentially should be targeted, are Mexico and Colombia, not Venezuela. So the idea that Venezuela is such a huge deal when it comes to hemispheric security or drug bust or something, it defies evidentiary logic. To your last question about where is JD Vance, well, if you talk to European diplomats, you'll get a very caustic answer, and the answer is he's doing everything that he can to secure his place for 2028. Whether that's true or false is obviously, I'm not privy, to the extreme inner dynamic of this campaign or this administration, but it makes a lot of sense. JD Vance's job would have always been difficult. He is fundamentally a restrainer. His instinct is in the right place, but he's also part of an administration which is an imperial administration with different lobby groups inside, and especially with a bunch of people who would have seamlessly worked for a DeSantis administration. So he has to defend a bunch of policies which, if he was president, he probably wouldn't have followed, especially on Iran. We have read his group chats. He's not a pro-Iran strike guy. Especially on Europe, he totally would have, done a far better job in retrenchment if he was the president. But he's not the president, and he has to be the president in 2028, and he has to run and get the endorsement from the previous president, Donald Trump, and he has to unite majority of the party. So it's understandable that it's not an easy job that he has to do. That being said, I do think that the problem that he will face in 2028 is not one of endorsement or one of party consolidation, but fundamentally one of defending his legacy. He will have to defend his legacy when it comes to Israel. He will have to defend his legacy when it comes to Iran. He will have to defend his legacy, the fact that we are not walking away from the war in Ukraine, even after Vance himself has said that in February or March. He will have to defend that we are still, NATO, part of NATO, where NATO is essentially not pulling, we can never expect Belgium to spend 2% in the defense. And and regardless of how much Estonia spends, it doesn't really matter, there are different ways of balancing NATO and balancing NATO budget. We are focusing on 2% at 5%, and it's nonsensical. He will have to defend that. And most importantly, if there is a war in Latin America, that would bring him in a Teddy Roosevelt position. Like, you are, at that point of time, he would stop being an America first and start being an imperialist in Latin America, which is, again, theoretically a fine and, defendable position, but it still has to be defended.
Hmm. Yeah, Brandon, I wanna go to you because Sumantra earlier in his answer alluded to this kind of realist America First case that some people are making in support of Trump's actions in the Caribbean, in support of this military buildup. You come from the more libertarian side of the restraint movement. So I imagine people in your kind of milieu aren't making this argument. But some people, MAGA aligned, TAC aligned people, what they are kind of defending this policy as one of focusing on the Western Hemisphere, and that they'll point out that American interests are at least implicated directly when it comes to migration and drugs. So it makes sense from their perspective to have a muscular foreign policy. I assume you disagree with that. And I'm just wondering, and Sumantra mentioned that you may know a lot about how drugs fit into this whole conversation. What is your kind of riposte? What is your response to people who defend this muscular policy in the Caribbean and these strikes and these threatened land strikes that we're seeing from some people in the kind of TAC aligned circles?
So I'll certainly concede that historically, like the closer that you get to the American homeland, the wider the aperture is for what constitutes an America First foreign policy, going back until the 20s and the 30s. Um, However, I would just implore them to think about the costs of said muscular policy, including on migration. And I wrote a long piece of TAC some months ago about the prospect of going to war in Mexico over the cartels. Perhaps the president read that article, because now the U.S. government has taken a more conciliatory approach on that particular issue, because the carrots in the carrots and the sticks approach worked, and the administration was able to get some sort of higher degree of cooperation from Mexico. But as far as Venezuela goes, I mean, if your concern is mass migration, what do you think a long drawn out regime changes operation is going to do? It's going to create massive migrant flows. And even on the migrant issue, one of the confusing things about this is, I believe Sumatra talked about earlier, is that the Trump administration was getting a cooperation on that issue. And as far as the drugs go, again, Sumatra mentioned, and I mean, even the DEA says this, it's like a minuscule amount of drug trafficking comes in through Venezuela, and even then, there are middlemen from Colombia, which sends cocaine to the United States, not fentanyl. And so the fact that we were talking about the drug problem, quite understandably, through the lens of fentanyl for many, many months, going back even to the first administration. And then we're just switching on a dime. We're talking about drugs generally, because they can't make the case that we're doing anything to stop fentanyl. And even if you just say, okay, whatever, we want to stop cocaine too, and interdiction isn't working, so what is going to blow up the boats? I mean, part of the argument for this is it's going to create deterrence. That we're going to start schwacking these guys, and then all of a sudden they'll want to stop. Well, we're up to what, 5 or 6 boats now, maybe 7. Well, it hasn't stopped yet. I mean, how many is it going to take before we see any kind of real reduction? And again, a very small amount of the drugs that come into the United States come through the Caribbean at all, right? It's Mexico and it's the Pacific. So think about the costs, think about the effectiveness. And also, I would implore people who think that we are getting back to some kind of golden age of American empire in the Caribbean. Look at the past. Coolidge and Harding had a much more pragmatic, but nevertheless, oftentimes muscular approach to the way that we handle ourselves in the region. But ultimately, look how it ended up. Hoover decided that the costs weren't there, and then we wound up implementing the good neighbor policy instead. I mean, do we really want to be, overseeing elections throughout Latin America? Do we really want? I mean, do we really want more on our plate in this respect? And just one last point on this, like this notion that, this is our hemisphere. Like, I am something of a Monroe Doctrine appreciator, but like I have a fairly constrained vision of what that is, and that's to keep outside powers out. It's not necessarily to meddle into the internal affairs of these countries. And I think people who are trying to piggyback on the argument by saying Venezuela somehow in league with Hezbollah or Hamas or Iran, I mean, I think that really kind of strains reality.
Yeah, I mean, the original Monroe Doctrine, as initially proclaimed by its progenitor, was much more constrained than when it became in the era of like CIA, covert operations, etc. I would add, because I agree with what you said about fentanyl, it seems like a pretext because it comes from Mexico. It's synthesized by Mexican drug cartels. That's the drug that's killing tens of thousands of Americans a year. It doesn't come from Venezuela. And I would also add, and then you mentioned migration, how it, if anything, destabilizing these countries is going to make that problem worse. The Trump administration closed the border. It's like their biggest achievement of the second administration. So they've kind of solved that issue. But this risks, unsolving it, like making it worse. And I would also add that this policy, one potential blowback will come in the form of Latin American public opinion, because Latin Americans broadly, like across the political spectrum, are very opposed to U.S. meddling. And it's really a gift to their left wing parties if it seems like the gringo in the White House is like telling them who they need to vote for and what they need to do. That could end up having negative effects from a U.S. perspective on Latin American elections. Although the conservatives have had some victories in Latin America, as I understand, in recent months. I want to move on to a different foreign policy crisis, one that Trump undoubtedly did inherit. Not just from the Biden administration, but from decades of poor U.S. policy, and that has to do with Russia, Ukraine, and our bilateral relationship with Russia. This is an interesting issue because Trump did kind of give the impression to a lot of people that he was going to pursue retrenchment in Europe, and he was really averse to, funding Ukraine's war effort and wanted to have better relations with Russia. I think that if you analyze his statements on the campaign trail and early in the administration and in his first administration, you see that he actually is willing to be kind of hawkish when it comes to Russia. Um, and right now, the latest news is that Ukraine used British, what are they called, Sumantra Storm Shadow missiles. I think they're jointly produced between France and Britain, but they were provided by Britain to Ukraine. Ukrainians used them to strike a chemical plant in Russia. That requires, as far as we understand, absolutely requires U.S. targeting intel, which previously Elbridge Colby at the Pentagon had, reversed that policy and said, we're not going to help Ukraine do that anymore. I guess that policy is back on, where we've also been helping them with their drone attacks deep inside Russia. These attacks also require U.S. intelligence because it's not like that Operation Spiderweb or whatever it was called that they just drove trucks in next to the targets and unleashed them. These go on long routes that require U.S. intel to kind of guide them to their destination. So we're seeing so-called peace through strength in action, where Trump is very willing to use forceful action to try to impose costs on Russia and get Putin to stop the war in Ukraine. So Sumantra, I want to know, I know you're in favor broadly of walking away from Ukraine, meaning, stop funding Ukraine's war effort. Do you think that these sticks that Trump is using have any chance of working to make the Ukraine war get resolved more quickly? What do you see as the escalation dangers? How worried should we be? And what do you think the optimal policy is?
Right. So, on Europe, especially, the idea is there is a contradiction in the America First idea of foreign policy in Europe. On one hand, we want to be kind of like the top dog in Europe. We don't want a competitor in the European Union or in the European continent. But on the other hand, we also want them to do exactly what we want to say, which is to take their own responsibility and take their own burden. So there is kind of like a broad contradiction in the idea. The second contradiction that is there in the Trump administration is, on one hand, they are technically, according to international law, I mean, you have to probably stretch the definition a little bit more, but broadly speaking, they are co-belligerents in this conflict. But on the other hand, they also really want to show that they are a neutral arbiter. They are, an absolute referee. They've got the only interest we have is for the war to stop. For the president is constantly talking about how the people are dying and we should stop the killing. Well, a couple of things. One, For every intelligence, as you mentioned, Andrew, intelligence support, there are basically 3 or 4 countries in Europe and America combined who can actually provide that kind of hands-on intelligence. The people who can do that have satellites on the sky. We are obviously one of them. The UK are broadly capable of doing that. Germany, to some extent, France. Now, if you take all of these countries, France doesn't really share satellite data with other countries. Their doctrine, stops them from sharing extremely, that doesn't mean that they cannot, or in this case, they didn't. But broadly speaking, historically, they never do that. Germany doesn't do anything without the United States telling them to do. Like it is historically, it has never done since post 45. I mean, historically, it has never done anything without the U.S. actually tacitly allowing or kind of like egging them to do that. That leaves 2 countries, Britain and the United States. Who are the ones who are providing intelligence? This is a good question to ask. Like, if for every British fire and forget weapons, you need targeting coordinates from America. For the spider web operation that they did in Russia, you not only needed targeting coordinates and places, but you actually needed hands-on intelligence on every single day movement of the Russian bomber fleet. The Russian bomber fleet, they don't stay in one place.
It rotates.
They constantly change locations, which means it's a long-term operation which was planned, with the satellite intelligence data that was given to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians waited a day before the Istanbul talks were supposed to happen to strike the Russian bomber fleet. The timing of that is eye-opening. It wasn't a decision that was taken in a whim. It was planned. This morning, after the Budapest summit was decided, and after the Polish government said that they are not going to let the guy who actually destroyed the Nord Stream and the Ukrainian, they freed him. We have seen 2 pipelines in Romania and Hungary torched by arguably by Ukrainian intelligence agents, which is technically a war on NATO countries within NATO by a country which is not part of NATO, and that's not Russia. It's Ukraine. Technically, Hungary can appeal to Article 5, saying that, hey, by the way, this is a foreign government's agent which is creating conditions for conflict in a NATO country. Whether they're going to do it is a different question altogether, but that is valid. My argument is simple. You cannot claim to be a neutral arbiter or referee while you are a co-belligerent. It is not that I want them to walk away. I think that is the only logical solution if you want them to stop the war. Look at what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan. No one took sides. It was a conflict where strength of arms prevailed. One country realized that they cannot continue the conflict. They, gave up territories. There wasn't negotiation, and now there is peace. If that same conflict logic applies to Ukraine and Russia, and if it is a war of attrition as we see ourselves to be, the 2 things that we cannot do is compel the Russians to stop the war, and also compel the Europeans and the Ukrainians to stop the war if they don't want to stop. We have got no capability of stopping Ukraine or the European Union to provide arms and weapons to Ukraine in continuation of this conflict, for as long as they want to continue, for as long as the laws and logic of our, attrition work, we cannot stop that. What posture then can we, go with? The only logical way is to say that, fine, we tried to get peace. You don't want peace. You're attacking, oil refineries in Budapest. You're attacking, Russian bomber fleets. You're bombing this, you're bombing that. If you want to fight a war, and it's understandable, it's your country which is under attack. I absolutely understand the logic of nationalism in this case. But if you want to go to the war, we are out. You can come back to us when you want to stop the war, and we can help in the negotiations. But as long as you are continuing this conflict, we are out. So I think that is the only logical way. The walking away part is not a policy suggestion in the way like that is something which is desirable, but rather that is the only alternative as what we see now.
Yeah, I was more skeptical than you that Ukraine absolutely needed American intelligence to execute Operation Spiderweb, but there are at least 3 data points from around that time that I think bolster your case that America was involved in the planning at some level, which is, one, there was this big New York Times piece that showed just how involved America was in Ukrainian war planning in general, right? So it seems kind of implausible that Ukraine could have planned this. And as you mentioned, it would require long term planning, that they could do so without our at least learning about it, right? So it seems like we probably gave them a green light. And then also, a couple of weeks later, Israel's Operation, what was it, Rising Lion in Iran, it had a similar type of special ops drone attack as what we saw during Operation Spiderweb, which suggests that the thing that they have in common, Ukraine and Israel, which is the patronage of America, what was involved in both cases. And then also, Trump had this Truth Social post like days before Operation Spiderweb, where he said, bad things might start happening inside Russia soon. And that was very conspicuously timed given what happened shortly thereafter. So I'm definitely open to the possibility. And I think it's quite likely that America did help that operation. Brandon, I want to come to you. Sumatra just mentioned, or just explained why he would favor walking away, even though it's not like optimal or ideal. It's not the, what you would imagine in an ideal world would happen. I kind of alone among people on tech's staff, at least among those like Kurt and Sumatra and myself who think a lot about foreign policy and Russia, Ukraine. I've been kind of alone in opposing walking away. I think that in order to keep the possibility of a negotiated settlement alive, we have to kind of keep Ukraine in the fight. Um, I think that the U.S. put Ukraine in a terrible position. It's basically like our fault that they're at war with Russia right now because of decades of just stupid U.S. policy that was kind of dangling the hope of NATO membership in front of them without actually letting them in. So we provoked Russia and kind of left Ukraine in the worst of all possible worlds. But sometimes as things heat up between Russia and the U.S., I become more open to the idea of walking away. Can you talk about, Brandon? What do you think about that? Where do you fall on that debate, and how do you judge Trump's handling of this whole Russia-Ukraine situation more generally?
Well, I often think that the president is stuck between two impulses in his own mind, and not necessarily that within his administration. And one is, yes, this is Biden's war. We'll just put aside the fact that he's the one who started all the lethal aid shipments. Nevertheless, like this is not our fight. This is not, uh, this is not aligned with a America First foreign policy. But nevertheless, as Samash said, there's still this impulse that America is the big dog, and that the United States is still the arbiter of like global peace. And the president will often have these things like within the same, true social post. And like one of these things has to give, right? The United States has to either be a secondary player in Europe, or a player not at all, which would be even better, or it can remain, the primary arbiter of security in Europe. And so long as the United States is backing, either directly or through intermediaries in Europe, then the Ukrainians are and their backers in the EU will have all the impetus to keep fighting a war that I think any honest person thinks that they cannot realistically win. I mean, if the goal is to keep throwing more conscripts at Russian bullets, I call it, but the math ain't math. So I think at some point the president is going to have to just wash his hands of this. But yet I also think that I probably he saw what happened to President Biden when the fall of Kabul happened. He probably doesn't want to see the fall of Kiev on his watch, because that's going to be pinned on him, rightly or wrongly. So I mean, seeing the sort of back and forth, especially now with the talk of tomahawks or not, I feel like ultimately this is just going to be decided on the battlefield, and Washington is going to be forced to take whatever comes out of that.
Yeah, you can already see Democrats kind of preparing the ground to scapegoat Trump for the fall of Kiev, which I think is going to be, if it happens, more dramatic than what we saw in Afghanistan, more salient in the public imagination, because, there's a kind of holdover from the Cold War mentality. Russia represents something like bigger, more significant in the American psyche. And this is a European country, so it seems culturally closer, and more horrifying to see their lines collapsing. I was having a kind of Twitter spat with Phil Gordon, the national security advisor of Kamala Harris, who was arguing that the evidence is overwhelming that Trump just will not challenge Putin. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, he's doing things that the Biden administration wasn't even willing to do in terms of facilitating strikes inside of Russia. Um, and I agree with you, Brandon. I mean, the math ain't mathing, as you put it. The manpower shortage in infantry units is acute. It's dire on the Ukrainian side. They're heading toward a brutal winter with very successful Russian air attacks on the energy infrastructure. I want to move on now to our last topic, which is Israel, Gaza, maybe the Middle East broadly. Trump, to his credit, brokered the ceasefire and peace deal in Gaza. He got these Arab and Muslim partners to put a lot of pressure on Hamas to do that. This isn't the first time that there's been a ceasefire and a release of hostages. It's not even the largest tranche of a release of living hostages, but these were the last remaining living hostages that Hamas released, all 20 of them, which is significant that Trump was able to get them to do that because, cynically speaking, that's like their last form of leverage. Um, so I think that is very good, but we saw the ceasefire break down in a major way this weekend. Um, Israel said that Hamas had broken the ceasefire by attacking its IDF soldiers. Kurt Mills of the American Conservative reported that a senior administration official told him that that's not true, that there was an unexploded, improvised explosive device that went off, that a tank or some sort of vehicle on the Israeli side ran over. And I think the White House is kind of really trying to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't restart the war in Gaza. And that's why they're sending a series of officials there. It's called the BB sitters now, which I think is a great phrase. But I'm quite pessimistic about where this is all headed. I think the internal domestic politics of Israel mean Bibi is less constrained now if he restarted the war because the anti-war movement inside Israel was mostly focused on getting the hostages back, and now they're back, right? So I think the White House is going to have to just sustain pressure on Israel. There's this problem that they want to create this international stabilization force, but that kind of requires Hamas to lay down their weapons to disarm. The withdrawal of IDF forces is linked to the disarmament of Hamas, but I don't see Hamas doing that willingly, and I don't see Arab and Muslim countries contributing peacekeepers unless Hamas does that, because otherwise they're going to be potentially in like a shootout with Hamas, which could be disastrous for them. Talking about peace through strength, Trump is now saying if Hamas doesn't disarm, if they don't stop trying to restore order by killing their members of the rival gangs, then we're going to destroy them. We're going to obliterate Hamas, right? But Israel has failed to obliterate Hamas after years of brutal fighting. And I'm curious what we means in this threat, and whether JD Vance has assured the American public that there's not going to be American boots on the ground, but I don't know how we are going to obliterate Hamas short of that. So Sumantra, can you talk about what you see as kind of the politics of the White House putting pressure on Netanyahu, whether you think this comprehensive peace plan that the Trump administration has helped broker has any hope of success?
Um, I This is one issue where things could have been a lot worse if there were any other Republican presidents. So credit goes to the Trump administration. At least they're trying to seek. Like, can you imagine Ted Cruz or Ron DeSantis as the U.S. president in this scenario? Like, we would have seen American boots on the ground in Gaza. So I give credit to the Trump administration when it comes to at least the instinctively wanting to have a peace in that region. That being said, a couple of things on this question as well. One hand, you remember that Lone Ranger comics that used to be in the 1920s? Like, who's we, Kimosabe? It's like, who's we in this equation? Like, who are we talking about? Like, we cannot. I mean, obviously, there are mixed messages from the Trump administration saying that, by the way, when we say we actually mean Turkey. Well, why? Why on earth would Turkey go and crack down on Hamas when they are essentially like cutting a deal with Israel so that the top Hamas leadership essentially can just slink back to Syria and then to Turkey. So that doesn't really seem to be auspicious. I think the question of peace in Gaza depends on two equations. you cannot make the same mistake as you made in, for example, Iraq, where you just like essentially delegitimized an entire ruling category and class of people as someone who are, they're completely PNGs, like they're never going to be in any kind of ruling, factions in any future government. That is just not going to happen. Like you cannot just say like, oh, Hamas is like the Ba'athist party, and that like nothing in the future will compose or have anyone who's ever been associated with Hamas. I mean, Hamas essentially ran charity organizations in Gaza. There are people who are like giving water in the name of under the Hamas flag. If you say that those people will never have any jobs in any future Gaza, realignment, you're essentially going to create conditions where they are going to be permanently revolutionaries, like just the same thing that happened in Iraq, for example. So you would have to legitimize at least some of the cadre, maybe not the hardliners, maybe not the actual fighters, but at least some of the hundreds and thousands of people who were associated in some way or the other in running, Gaza under Hamas since at least 2006. And you would have to mainstream them, and you would legitimize them, and you would have to kind of help them change their jerseys and take part in the new administration. Whether Israel wants to do that or they're going to continue their assassination is a different question. The second point is the biggest issue that we are keeping an eye on, at least in this magazine and even in other parts, are the looming rivalry between Turkey and Israel. The Israelis were opposed to Turkish troops, for example, in northern Syria. Guess what? There will be Turkish human intelligence in Gaza. At what point of time that leads to a conflict? Like, when we are talking about renewed conflict in Gaza, President Trump and, Vice President J.D. Vance is, telling us that, look, there's not going to be any American boots on the ground. Turkey is going to take care of Hamas. What if Israel knocks out a couple of, Turkish agents and a couple of Hamas leadership after the new, technocratic government is formed? We don't know the answer to those questions. So a lot depends on, it's kind of like how similar in political science, you have the dyadic analysis, like, your future policy suggestion would depend on what the other side is doing. We don't get to control Israel, given that, they essentially bombed Qatar when the negotiators were there. Like, I don't know what they're going to do tomorrow. 2 years' time, we have a technocratic government in Gaza. What happens when Israel restarts the war? I mean, or bombs a couple of places, especially with foreign, Pakistani and Indonesian troops being present there. We don't know. So there's a lot of risk. So far, I would still want to credit the Trump administration because at least, given compared to every single other Republican administration, their instinct is correct. They want to have peace in Gaza. They want to have local partners play, at least the frontline troops, or the frontline order, providing partners in that region. So I think that is something which is creditworthy.
Yeah, I mean, they put more pressure on Bibi than the Biden administration did as well. Because of this Qatar strike, like that's probably going to go down as like an all-time strategic error by Israel. Because when they did that, they really pissed off Trump's team. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner apparently had been, preparing some sort of peace deal. They were actively, trying to back channel with Hamas. And then Israel just attempted to kill Hamas negotiators that they were trying to work with and did so by striking Qatar, which Trump cares a lot about his relationship with these Gulf states. And then now it seems like the administration is kind of keeping the pressure up to an extent. I was kind of heartened to hear JD Vance talking about this issue of Hamas taking a long time to return the deceased hostages because that's part of the first phase of the ceasefire peace deal arrangement. A lot of people on the Israeli side, some hardliners, have been saying that Hamas is in violation of the agreement because they didn't return all of the remains of the dead hostages. And JD Vance was saying the truth, like basically it's pretty much impossible for them to do so, at least swiftly, because there's a lot of communication problems with Hamas. They're not really in touch with everyone across the strip. The bodies, the corpses are buried beneath rubble, and they're just hard to retrieve and hard to not lose. And so he was counseling patience and just saying this is a kind of a big ask, not just politically but in terms of logistically getting them to actually do this. Brandon, I'll leave you with the last word. John Mearsheimer has expressed pessimism about this Gaza peace plan because he says it's going to require Trump to maintain a high level of pressure on Netanyahu, and Trump won't be able to do that because the Israel lobby can just go after Trump. and make sure that Netanyahu can get what he wants, which is probably to restart the campaign in Gaza. Do you agree with that Mearsheimer analysis? Do you agree with me that Trump absolutely, and with Mearsheimer and Sumantra, that Trump probably does need to maintain pressure on Israel to make sure this Gaza peace plan continues? And how do you see this shaping up going forward?
Well, this whole crisis has really been troubling for me as a person who doesn't like entangling alliances. But it seems that the one thing that is keeping Trump somewhat towards restraint is this set of unofficial alliances with the Gulf states and also with some degree with Erdogan. And as Sumatra said, I think some credit is due to the president because there has been those external forces trying to balancing hit him out a little bit. And I think it's, I think the idea that the administration would be able to put significant pressure on Israel without that countervailing force it's difficult to imagine. I mean, Israeli politics is trending in one direction, and that is further to the right and more towards kind of internal settler politics. So if there is going to be any kind of positive change, and again, this pains me to say, as a person who wants to be after the Middle East entirely, it's going to be because there are other forces acting upon the president beyond just the more traditional one in the United States of the Israel.
Okay, so I think this brings us close to the end of today's conversation. Usually, we tech staffers pick a pick of the week, an article from the last 7 days or so on the American Conservative website or the print edition that we want to highlight. I know I could speak for Sumantra and say that he and I both want to pick When Peace Through Strength Means War is Peace. That is the piece that you wrote, Brandon, with Beckett Elkins. Who is Beckett Elkins? I don't think I know this person.
So Beckett was one of our summer interns. He's currently a senior at Yale, and he helped. He braved the archives with me, going through the papers of Robert Taft. You see, I was able to get a Robert Taft reference in this podcast, but he also he helped me with this piece. He did a lot of research, and he did a lot of the historical writing on it.
Nice. Well, you guys did a great job. I highly recommend that article to our listeners. I want to thank our listeners for listening till the end. Remind them you can watch these episodes on YouTube. And I want to thank you, Sumatra, and you, Brandon, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.